Welcome to Overeducated and Underemployed. I'm Feddun, and this is the last part of our three-part series on nostalgia and how it's used in different mediums. I started off talking about music, reunion tours, and things like that specifically. The last episode, you'll remember, we talked a lot about the role of nostalgia in marketing movies and the shift from focusing on actors and actresses to intellectual properties. And we up talking about Indiana Jones quite a bit. And I ended the episode talking about the game that just came out and how it was a way to be able to make something in the same spirit of an old movie without having to compensate for the fact that actors have aged and settings might be hard to come by. You spend the first part of the game in Vatican City, which I've been there. It's pretty accurately recreated from what I can remember. That being said, there's a lot of places that you go in the Vatican City in the game that is not accessible to the public. So I'm sure a lot of areas had to take a lot of liberties. I don't know what kind of access they had, but definitely feels like the Vatican. So the mix of realism and fantasy in this game is really interesting. There's a lot of homages to scenes from the original trilogy. There's a lot of things that are explained that didn't necessarily get addressed in the original trilogy. I don't want to say plot holes, but plot gaps. The reason I bring this game up is because I think it represents one of the best if not the best video games based on a movie franchise ever made. It used to be a joke back when I was younger that all games based on movies were terrible. They were cash grabs for intellectual property. Sound familiar? The thing is that as gaming has gotten more popular, technology has gotten better, and movie studios have gotten a little bit smarter about using games as a medium to tell stories rather than just make money off of games based on movies. I think that we're actually seeing intellectual property being used in the best way possible when it comes to video games. And that's always been the case. And I think there's pretty distinct reasons about the medium for that. And I'll talk about that in a second. But if you think about the history of Nintendo has used the same intellectual property through all of their mainstay games for the last 40 years. And they've been very successful at innovating each generation of game. In fact, that's what they're known for, right? They're known for their innovation in gaming. And I think that leads to what I think is unique about video games is there are so many variables in the medium and there's so much innovation still happening that having a kind of a staple or an anchor like the intellectual property like Mario or Zelda, Link, is what grounds them. We've talked earlier about how constraint can be, maybe I'll talk in other episodes, whether it's been in this series or with interviews, about how constraint can actually be a blessing to creativity sometimes. I think when developers use the same intellectual property, completely new set of rules that they can use to make the game, it still grounds them in a way that makes both them able to make something comprehensive and cohesive and gives the player enough familiarity to where they aren't completely lost right away. And even when you're not talking about intellectual properties, you're still talking about game types and typically the mechanics from one game to another within one type of game are the same. Another example of intellectual property being used successfully and reinventing itself is the Civilization series. Civilization was one of the earliest, Civ 2 was one of the earliest multiplayer PC games, but Civ 1 was, if I'm not mistaken, one of the earliest strategy games that was really popular. And if you've never played Civilization, think of it as something like Risk, only far more complicated because there's all these equations and rule sets that can go on in the background. But think of it as something, the mechanics of the basic gameplay is something like Risk, where you take turns, or even just like a complicated chess, where the game board is a planet or a map of a part of a planet, however you want to describe it. Those are all settings you can choose to, depending on how large you want the map to be. But the point I'm making is that the intellectual property there is human history. And so they've been able to do anything and everything with it. Now, the mechanics of the game remain essentially the same in the sense that it's still a turn based strategy game. But I think the big difference is that there can be a lot more of variation as the technology advances. Just like films have reinvented themselves as CGI and things like that, Disney's remaking all these movies of their animated classics. They're calling them live action versions of their movies, but they're not. They're just really detailed computer animation. And the concept isn't much different when it comes to games. They're just taking the latest technology and taking their game and applying that technology to it. But I think the difference is like the interactivity creates a lot more variables just in the foundation of the medium itself. But the other thing is the technology in gaming has advanced a lot quicker in our lifetime than the technology of film. And even if you look at the earliest films and the latest films, I think that it's pretty clear the difference between the earliest films and the latest films is much less than the difference between the earliest video games and the latest video games. It took 40 years for games to even start to look realistic, whereas it depended on what you were filming, whether you needed special effects at all. Just getting humanoid creatures to look realistic without falling into the uncanny valley has been one of the biggest challenges for gaming. If you look at the difference between Pong and Indiana Jones or Starfield, the difference is so much more drastic than the difference between the 1933 King Kong and Peter Jackson's King Kong. Like, the difference is just astounding. For one, I think films had their foundation in hundreds of years of stage plays and sets and things like that, whereas computers of all kinds were completely new. Yes, they had their foundation in games, but once again, the lack of constraint made it so there were some really terrible games that were made, especially early on in gaming. But let's go back to Nintendo for a minute, though. I think Nintendo's a really good case study for what I'm talking about here, where an intellectual property like Mario, who started as Jumpman in Donkey Kong, by the way, and then had his own game with Mario Brothers, and then it went from there. They've used him in all kinds of different games. And so he's the anchor, but the gameplay between Mario Kart and Mario RPG couldn't be more different. The gameplay, even between some of the Mario games themselves, the platformers, like Super Mario Sunshine with the water pack, it is a completely unique game in the Mario world. But the thing that's the same is that there's always unique power-ups in each game that give Mario different powers to do different things. And that's how new power-ups in a movie is a lot less exciting than new power-ups and abilities when you get to perform them as the character in the game. And the mechanics and the control. Nintendo has innovated controls over the years as well, right? In fact, it's like what they do probably more than anything. They don't really focus on graphics as much. They're known for not really being a driving force in technology when it comes to that, but they are a driving force when it comes to innovation. And the Wii is what brought gaming to grandmas, because all they had to do was pick it up, swing the tennis racket, or throw the bowling ball. That type of motion control innovation is what has contributed to the motion controls in virtual reality being something that wasn't something that had to build from the ground up. Gaming has moved towards virtual reality. If you think back to something like the Virtual Boy, which is not virtual reality and probably ruined people's ideas of it for a very long time, in a similar way that phone VR may have been neat for a minute, but it ultimately was very gimmicky, made a lot of people sick, and made a lot of people just not even want to mess with VR. Whereas now, even in 10 years or so, the technology has gotten so much better to where both like things like motion controls are possible in VR, and things like tracking to where when you move your head, the environment, It reacts just as if you're moving your head in the real world. So that gets rid of a lot of the motion sickness. The tracking has gotten fast enough to where there's no delay in your head moving. That's going to make you nauseous. Just the technology catching up has made VR so much better. And I think earlier attempts to make it the public would want to do long before it was ready for public consumption. And it still might not be really ready for public consumption in some aspects, just because of the cost to get something small enough to be something that people are willing to wear on a long enough basis to play games or whatever. It still might not be there yet, right? But the point I'm making is there's no nostalgia attached to VR gaming inherently. Nobody looks back at their younger years and says, oh, I remember playing VR and how much fun that was. No, it's actually the opposite. If anybody has memories of VR from the past, they're probably not very good ones. You're probably not nostalgic for those things. So why do I bring this up? Because I think nostalgia is one of the things that VR excels at for a multitude of reasons. One, you can, again, reimagine classic games, even if without the intellectual property attached. You can have games that are very similar to classic games. But even porting classic games like Resident Evil 4 got put into VR, and that was a GameCube game. And so that game was like very nostalgic for me. And I remember hanging out with my friends late at night and having to turn the game off because we got too scared at one point. And now getting to be in the game is very nostalgic and also new. But the other thing that VR can do successfully is recreate things that don't. I went to Universal Studios quite a bit when I was a kid. And if you have been there in the last 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, I don't remember when it changed, but you've probably seen the Simpsons ride. But that ride used to be a Back to the Future ride. And instead of being in the car that you get in the Simpsons ride, you would get in DeLorean time machine and you'd go back in time, and Biff would be trying to chase you down and you'd end up getting eaten by a dinosaur. And to be honest with you, I don't even think they changed the movements and the mechanics of the ride when they rebranded it to The Simpsons, because the moment that Lisa sticks you in her mouth like you're a pacifier is almost identical to the moment that a T-Rex eats you and then spits you back out in the original ride. So I really think they just reskinned the ride entirely with new cars, that essentially the same movements, new videos. I digress. First of all, that ride, the Simpsons ride, is probably pretty nostalgic for a lot of people that grew up watching The Simpsons. But I grew up going on the Back to the Future ride, and somebody has got hold of the videos that were used to make the ride and digitally inserted them into, they've recreated the entire Back to the Future ride in VR. You can go ride it. It's amazing. One of the places I would perform stand-up comedy in virtual reality quite a bit was a recreation of a place called the Brainwash Cafe that was a real laundromat and coffee shop that had comedy nights in, I believe, San Francisco. Yeah, it was in San Francisco. It's permanently closed now. But if you go look at the photos of this place that are up online, they look a whole lot like the virtual reality version of the place that I've performed several times. So the point is that during COVID, that place closed. People missed it. World builders, which are essentially like a game designer, but they're building like a room that's interactive usually, or a world, it's not typically a whole game. It's usually just an environment that might have some interactive features. But they designed a recreation of the Brainwash Cafe in VR chat, and they still hold comedy in what feels like exactly the same place. So nostalgia can be a very powerful tool. They've also, and I don't want to get into this too much because I will be talking about the therapeutic benefits of virtual reality in other episodes, used virtual reality to take elderly people with Alzheimer's to their neighborhoods that they grew up in, and it triggers memories for them and helps recover things that they had forgotten and put them in a place of remembering again. And it can also make them very happy. And you can actually access Google Earth. So you can go back and do the time jump feature and go back only a certain number of years. But as time goes on, that library will grow and you can essentially go back in time to your own neighborhood as it is now or a few years ago. But think about the ability to do that in the future. The technology changes so fast and the interactivity creates so many variables. Having something like the same intellectual property can be comforting and an anchor, or having the same location that you once had can be comforting or be an anchor or be something that is a constraint, self-imposed constraint by the developers to make sure that they don't go too far off the rails with the innovation. And I think maybe if we continue to look at Nintendo, the Wii U might be a good example of this, where it felt like if you look now at where Nintendo ended up with the Switch and started with the Wii U looks like a prototype that was like halfway between the two that didn't quite, and they should really probably should never have launched it. I think they would probably agree with that. It failed pretty well. So much so that they've released several games that were originally on Wii U only on the Switch, just because not enough people had a Wii U in order to play them in the first place. The gameplay, it's always been more about the gameplay, and they lost. The Switch 2 was recently announced, and if you look at it, it feels, if you look at the Wii and then you look at something like the DS, and they clearly tried to merge them as much as they could with the Switch. I think the difference is with took a step backwards with the motion controls Switch from the Wii. And so I think the motion controls for the Switch 2 look very promising to the where I think they might. There's a reason we haven't seen a lot of Wii games remastered, because the Switch is not precise enough to recreate the motion controls, but I believe the Switch 2 will be. So I think you're going to see once again a whole generation of games get remade, maybe essentially being the same game that they always were, but truly for a new generation and truly for a new innovation of controls. Because you're going to have the ability to have these games in 4K. They have remastered several of these old games. Just because they don't remake the gameplay doesn't mean that they update. I think about the remake of Link to the Past, Zelda. The gameplay was essentially the same, but they completely redid the graphics, and it was a much more pleasant experience. And I'm trying to remember. Yeah, it was Link to the Past they recreated for Switch. And I'm thinking about the Metroid Prime. I've been playing the Metroid Prime remaster for Switch recently. And I really do like it without the motion controls, because I think they've done a good job of making them translate well to the modern controller, because partially just because like controllers have become more and more set up for shooters in the way that Metroid controls. Like Metroid is not a shooter in the traditional sense, but if you're playing it on a console without motion controls and the first person view, your movement and everything and shooting it's a shooter, but it's a Metroid games are their own thing. But I think what's really important to remember about Metroid is that it has always innovated its gameplay, from being a side scroller to being 3D to having motion controls to now the fourth one is going to have mouse controls. And from what I'm hearing, the mouse controls on the Switch are really quite good. One common theme that's happened throughout all three of these episodes is that typically nostalgia cannot carry something on its own. Something can be nostalgic, but it still has to be good. You know, it's going to fall pretty flat. People are going to see through that, poke holes in it pretty quickly. And you find that a lot in gaming with these classic gaming collections. Really, some of these games are terrible by today's standards. One thing that I think is true for games, less true for movies and television, and almost non-existent for music, is their ability to age based on technology. Don't get me wrong, music is always innovating with technology as well, but I don't think that techno music makes blues music sound less appealing or less interesting. Maybe I'm wrong about that to younger folks, but to me, as someone who just loves music and all genres of music, I don't sit there and listen to Robert Johnson and be like, oh, this would be so much better with a full drum kit, or with some distortion on the guitar, or some horns playing, or like with a sick beat drop at the end. And whatever it is that he didn't do because of his constraints at the time isn't something that's missed. If some things that I've talked about in some of these interviews is like the organic version of a song is usually what people are most after. I talk about that with J. Roddy Walston, and I talk about it with a few other people as well, is like just getting to the essence of a song sometimes is really great, and you're not hiding behind anything. But sometimes having a lot of interesting sounds and noises is really cool too. And I think there are a lot of classic games that are good. I think it's harder for movies and television to age. And I think it's even harder for games to age than it is for movies and television too. And I think for the same reasons that we've talked about in terms of relying on innovation change to be the driving force in being the reason to recreate something. And I think that's true with music too, right? But I don't think that someone covering the Beatles makes somebody less likely to like that Beatles song or even the original, even if they like the cover a lot, right? Whereas it's really hard to take a step backwards in gaming sometimes. Some classic games are really good and stand the test of time. And that's why, like, of the recreation of Link to the Past didn't really need to change the gameplay much. But when you look at these big collections of classic games that have just sometimes 50, 100 games in them, and like 80% of them are garbage. It's like, why did you even put that on the cartridge? Why not just give me like the 20 games that are here that are decent, right? That do stand the test of time. And Atari's found a way around that. And maybe it's the historian in me and the museum curator in me, but Atari has done these things. So Atari's done these things called it's Atari 50, and they think they put out the base game and then they put out an expansion or two. But essentially, it is a digital archive and museum of the history of the company with videos and interviews, the original flyers for all the games in the arcade and for the home system. And so you're not just blindly playing all these crappy games, and some of them are still good, but even makes the crappy ones enjoyable because you're playing them with a bunch of context and you're understanding how they contributed to the history of gaming. You get the marketing material so you can maybe understand what the game was about back before they were able to show you in the game everything. You had to use a little bit more imagination, suspend some disbelief, and I think the marketing materials that don't typically come with those collections really help you put yourself in that mindset. But also just like listening to the developers talk about the games, even if you only play the game for 10 or 15 minutes, there's still a ton of games in this collection. So even if you spend 10 or 15 minutes playing each game, you're still going to get dozens of hours because there's documentaries and interviews. Whereas I think with the context that the Atari 50 collection provides, you can really put yourself into the context of the game for a minute, both the historical context and, like I said, the suspension of disbelief sometimes, to where even if the game sucks, you understand what was appealing about it at the time, why, and especially when you do the Atari 50 thing in kind of chronological order, I think it really helps too, because each kind of generation of games, you can see the technological advancements in them. And then they also took a handful of the classic games and remade them for the modern era, which kind of illustrates exactly what I'm talking about now. Just with modern controls and graphics, they didn't completely reinvent the wheel on any of these games. Nostalgia being a big part of gaming and working, I think, is demonstrated really well. And you can, if you have any interest in the history of games or really just the history of technology and the Atari culture too. I mean, it was a pretty interesting company. There's a lot of really interesting stories. I highly recommend that Atari 50 collection. Like I said, not all the games are good, but even the bad games, when you have the context there, I think it really makes them a lot more forgiving and makes it a lot more forgivable. So I highly recommend that. I've enjoyed just rambling about how nostalgia is used in both like creating and marketing these three different types of mediums. I'm sure this will come up again. If you got this far, thank you so much. I really appreciate you tuning in to Overeducated and Underemployed. Make sure to check out my website, feddun.net. I've got updates about what's coming up on the podcast, got updates about where I'll be live. And of course, there's always a place to donate if you want to contribute. I do travel to conduct some of these interviews. So if you want to help me able to do that more, that'd be greatly appreciated. I really appreciate you tuning in. I'm Feddun, and this has been Overeducated and Underemployed. And remember, if you want me to answer a question on the podcast, go ahead and send it over to feddunxr@gmail.com. That's FEDDUNXR@gmail.com.